Today, we'll be talking about Chapter 23, Section 1, and that is A New Deal Fights the Great Depression. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president after Herbert Hoover's massive defeat in the 1932 election. We learned about the Republican Party last week and how a conservative would approach an economic crisis. We learned how conservative economics relies on rugged individualism. And the philosophy is that one must rely on themselves and not the government. And now we're going to look at a different approach, and that's what we call liberal economics, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to take an active role in promoting the social welfare of the American people. And his program called the New Deal was created to combat the Great Depression.
He needed to be tough. There were other kinds of shocks. In Washington, the Supreme Court had ruled some of Roosevelt legislation unconstitutional. He had run into other difficulties. Some of his early advisers had left him. Some old friends had become bitter critics. The critics overlooked the fact that Roosevelt was more than a gentleman with a winning smile. He was a tough politician out to keep power.
You and I know that the values of property of all kinds, farms, houses, automobiles, securities, and every other kind of property have increased so greatly since 1933 that today we are once more in the black. We were insolvent, today we're solvent.
After 4 years of Roosevelt presidency, the old order got another chance in a new election. The Republicans had found a new standard-bearer in Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas. There was a hard-fought campaign.
The people of America have no quarrel with business. They insist only that the power of concentrated wealth shall not be abused.
Roosevelt won in a landslide. The New Deal had been vindicated, not in the minds of intellectuals, then in the hearts of the people. His second inaugural address was again a call to action.
But here is the challenge to our democracy. I see millions lacking the means to buy the products of farm and factory, and by their party denying work and productiveness to many other millions. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. In taking again the oath of office as President of the United States, I assume solemn obligation of leading the American people forward along the road over which they have chosen to advance.
But there was to be no advance. The New Deal was over.
So today I get to introduce you to an amazing person, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the New York governor and then nominated by the Democratic Party to run for president in 1932. As a reform-minded individual, he convinced America of its need for the public to take an active role in the welfare and concern of its people. The Democrats overwhelmingly won the White House, running against Herbert Hoover, whose failures with the bonus army and in combating the Great Depression had caused the public to turn against the Republican Party. The Democrats now have a majority in the Senate, in the House. They now control the executive, and we'll see how they take steps towards gaining control even in the Supreme Court. It's one of the few times in American history where all branches of the government were on the same page, working together to combat a crisis. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was no expert on all things. A good leader surrounds themselves with brilliant individuals who can give good guidance and support. Roosevelt called his cabinet the Brain Trust. Very capable individuals who helped him formulate policies to alleviate problems in the Great Depression. They called the programs, the New Deal. The New Deal focused around the 3 R's. And the 3 R's are essential to understanding the economic recovery that we're going to be discussing. Relief, recovery, reform. Everything we'll talk about today falls into one of those 3 categories. Relief for the needy, recovery for the economy, and reform for the financial system. So hopefully these things won't happen again.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in 1932 and dropped this now famous line during his inaugural speech.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Pretty good advice, because during the Roosevelt administration, people generally believed there was plenty to be afraid of. There was the continued economic crisis of the Great Depression, and there was a guy named Hitler over in Europe who was definitely scary. The only thing people weren't afraid of during the period from 1932 to 1945 was the task of remembering the name of a new president, because it was always Roosevelt. He was our longest-serving president, elected 4 times. Some say he was the closest we ever had to a king. And honestly, FDR had about as much money as some kings. Despite his wealth, Roosevelt's own personal hardships helped him understand the hardships of regular Americans.
He had had polio, and it had crippled his legs. He could not walk without assistance. When he walked, he would have to lock the steel braces on both of his legs so that they would be rigid, and then someone would take him by the arm. But the public was not really aware that he was a cripple, because the news media entered into a conspiracy of silence.
It was said, in fact, in the 30s that it took a man on crutches to teach a crippled nation how to walk again.
For America to walk again, 10 million Americans needed to get back to work.
Franklin D. Roosevelt came to office at a terrible time in America where 1 out of 4 people who wanted jobs and needed jobs could not find jobs. A lot of parents had children who were going hungry, and Franklin D. Roosevelt decided that the only way to get the economy going again was for the government to spend a lot of money and even go into deficit, up to a point where people could get their jobs back again.
Roosevelt launched the New Deal, which created programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and massive public works projects designed to provide jobs for Americans. It was kind of like a massive chore list for the American public in exchange for an allowance. To sell his ideas to the public, FDR embraced the new technology of the day and aired radio broadcasts that he called fireside chats. Today, he'd probably do a podcast.
Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chat was very simply the forerunner of every presidential address that we see today. But it was a radical break, taking advantage of the latest technology. Radio was coming into its own. Franklin Roosevelt became the first president to really effectively use radio. His signature opening was, "My friends," and they believed him.
And FDR used the radio to help people understand his policy decisions.
He closed down the banks for a couple of days and then helped explain to people how the banks worked, how they shouldn't pull all their money out of it, and he inspired confidence.
Though the New Deal provided a financial safety net for many Americans, some felt that Roosevelt was exercising too much power as president and spending too much of America's money. Another strain on America's finances was the war overseas, which landed on America's shores at Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
FDR had to shift focus away from the economic hard times to begin the task of being a war president.
Franklin Roosevelt led America to prepare for war. The draft was reinstated. The armed forces were building even before Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And then afterwards, Roosevelt, working with his ally in Britain, Winston Churchill, helped bring out the success and the strength of America. It was the end of the Depression. It was an incredible expansion of America's industrial capacity.
Unfortunately, while fighting for freedom abroad, Roosevelt severely restricted the freedoms of Japanese Americans at home.
Franklin Roosevelt is lionized for winning World War II, but he's also criticized for putting 110,000 Japanese Americans in what were in effect concentration camps.
Roosevelt has also been criticized for not doing more to stop the systematic murder of the Jews during the Holocaust.
He said the only way to help the Jews was to defeat Germany on the battlefield. This policy was called Rescue Through Victory. Jewish organizations worried, however, that if rescue was postponed until the day of Allied victory, there might not be any Jews left alive to save.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our longest-serving president, lived to see the end of the Depression, but missed the official end of World War II by just a few months. The Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, but FDR had died in office 4 months earlier. Fortunately, though, he had already checked off most of the items on his presidential chore list.
The first 100 days of a president's term are extremely important. This is when the public is most supportive of what a president hopes to achieve. This is called the honeymoon period, where if a person is going to prove their effectiveness, they have those first 100 days to show what can be done. Roosevelt managed to pass 15 major New Deal laws during this time. It's unheard of. Again, he has the legislature in compliance and in agreement, and that can be rare sometimes. He had a clear mandate, meaning that the people were overwhelmingly in support of he and his party. And so when that happens, you see an overturn in the legislature as well as the executive, meaning that people were voting straight down party ticket, that the Democrats were able to take control of the White House as well as the legislature, allowing for a number of very important laws to be passed. Number one is the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And this permitted the Treasury Department to inspect all American banks, to close the ones that were insolvent, and to bolster and bail out or loan money to the ones that could stay open. This restored public confidence in the banks, allowing people to keep their money in the banks, and it was meant to prevent these rushes on banks that we saw last week.
With the banks that closed down, what happens to the people that had their money in there?
So the government would actually take over those banks, and we'll see more about that in just a second. So, a president must be not just a good decision maker. They must be a good communicator. Even more so today, now that the cameras are on the president and every action he does. But at this time, Roosevelt was able to take advantage of a new technology, radio. And he communicated to the American people on a regular basis through radio. He called it the fireside chats. He would sit with his young niece, and he would explain to her the problems facing our country and how he was going to do his very best to solve them. And so, in explaining complex economic theory to a child, he was helping the American people to grasp what must be done. And so again, a president, a good leader, must be an effective communicator and able to relate difficult information simply. Because of these 15 major New Deal pieces of legislation, they were new. Many of these ideas had never been tried. Many of them represented a significant shift in the way the government functions. For example, the Glass-Steagall Act established the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And to answer your question, it insures individual bank accounts up to $250,000, still exists today. When you write a check, when you put money in a bank, even if that bank collapses or closes, your account is insured by the federal government. It also regulates banking practices. And the FDIC was created by using a law called the Glass-Steagall Act. And you may have heard of this law being mentioned in the 2016 presidential campaign because some candidates want to bring it back. It was done away with in the 1990s during the bank's period of being deregulated. And you could argue that the deregulations through the 1990s allowed banks to do some sketchy things which caused the 2008 financial crisis. And now some politicians are proposing to pass once again a law that proved so effective through the Great Depression. You see, it insured individual bank accounts. And that part is still with us. Every check you write will have the words FDIC at the bottom. So your accounts are protected. But the second part, the regulating banking practices, I'll get into in a moment.
Do you think that if it was, like, they would change it to adjust for inflation over time?
You mean the amount of money insured?
Yes.
I'm assuming so, yeah. So, I mean, $250,000 is the current amount that your account is insured. It was probably much less at that time. The second part requires a little explanation. You see, regulating banking practices. Today, banks can take your money and play the stock market with it. They can engage in speculative trading, meaning buying some sketchy stocks. And there's not much that can be done about it. They can gamble with your money and get away with it. And that's part of why the Great Recession of 2008 occurred. Banks were gambling with your money. It was called the subprime loan mortgage crisis. Read more about it later. And we'll talk more about it in here much later. Well, you see, Glass-Steagall outlawed that practice. In fact, it along with the Federal Securities Act, were hoping to restore public confidence in the banks and in the stock market by making them accountable to regulation. The Federal Securities Act created the Securities and Exchange Commission, a watchdog agency which was meant to regulate the stock market. Something else that Roosevelt did was he ended prohibition. Now, a president doesn't have the authority to overturn the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition. But he was able to a president can introduce legislation to Congress, meaning that he suggested to Congress, and he said, and I quote, "It's time America had a drink." And Congress was like, yeah, let's legalize it, let's tax it, let's generate revenue and create jobs. And so alcohol became legal as a result of the 21st Amendment, requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress in 1933 to repeal the 18th Amendment. So all of those things I just told you, they fall into a category of reform. We have to ensure that a crisis of this scale cannot occur again. Now, we also have the challenge of recovering the economy. And we'll start with the farming sector. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was aimed at helping farmers have profitable businesses once more. In fact, it authorized subsidies of agricultural goods, literally paying farmers to grow less food so that the price of crops would go up and that the supply would go down. This was going to be controversial, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But the next one was not controversial at all. The Tennessee Valley Authority, in fact, is still around today, and they still provide electricity for a large part of the southeastern United States. And it began as a jobs creation program. They built a number of dams around the southeast, quite a number of the lakes that we have near us, Kiowee, Jocassee, Lake Lure, Lake Summit, Lake Logan. Essentially all the lakes in our region are created by hydroelectric dams. Lake Fontana. In fact, there are only a few naturally occurring lakes in the southeastern United States. Most were created as hydro projects. Not only does this create jobs, because it requires a massive labor force to construct a dam of that scale, but it also provides electricity to rural parts of the region. Next, jobs programs. Still along the lines of economic recovery. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to put young men to work. They built a number of the roads around here. The Blue Ridge Parkway was built by the CCC. Most of the forest roads in Pisgah, most of the trails that we access on a regular basis were built by the CCC. Roosevelt realized that we had a crumbling infrastructure, that roads needed to be built, bridges needed to be rebuilt in many cases, and that a massive labor force would be required to do these projects. And this would create jobs.
Where's all the money coming?
We'll get that in just a second. So, next is the Public Works Administration. We are talking about the creation of tens of millions of jobs here. Which, excellent question, where's the money coming from? And we'll get to that. The Public Works Administration commissioned the creation of sculptures, of fountains, of parks. Mount Rushmore was built during this time as a result of the Public Works Administration, and again aimed at reducing unemployment. The Civil Works Administration, this is to create jobs for civil servants like teachers. In fact, it provided the funds to build new schools and provided the funds to put teachers back to work, to open the schools that had closed. And those items would have fallen under economic recovery. But now back to reform. You see, people accused Roosevelt of being a socialist because he pushed for increased regulation on private business. For example, the National Industrial Recovery Act established codes of fair practice for industries. We learned that one of the underlying causes of the Great Depression was a gap in salary between managers and employees, an income gap between the wealthy and the poor. And so the National Recovery Administration was created to set industry standards for workers, to set maximum prices for certain products so that price gouging did not go on, and that is companies taking advantage of a limited or short-term monopoly on a certain good. And then finally, even limited by federal law production of certain items. We've seen this in wartime where governments take greater control over private industry, and essentially what Roosevelt was doing here with the New Deal was declaring war on the Great Depression. And we spent nearly as much as we did, well, equivalent to what we did in the First World War. But also relief. You see, millions of Americans had lost their homes, their jobs, everything. And many banks were having to foreclose on homes. When a bank has to foreclose on your home, of course you become homeless, and that's awful. But the banks are also losing money on an investment when they foreclose on a home. And so it's advantageous for the banks to not have to foreclose, and it's certainly advantageous for the families who get to keep their homes. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to provide emergency federally backed low-interest loans that could be paid back at a later time. The Federal Housing Administration also provided loans for new mortgages or repairs of old existing homes. Perhaps one of the most important relief organizations created during this time is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It is now called the Federal Emergency Management Administration, also known as FEMA. And you may have heard of them. Anytime we have a natural disaster, FEMA will go in, and people whose homes have been displaced, they will get them temporary shelter and food and clothing. And so this group does amazing things to help large numbers of people who are affected by crises beyond their control. And this is to provide for the basic needs of people hardest hit by the Depression. Because you may have heard from one of the little clips of Roosevelt's speeches that 1/3 of Americans lacked the basic goods for living, lacked shelter, food, and clothing. And how can someone begin to provide for themselves when they don't have a safe place to sleep? And so we had this relief organization created, which continues to help millions of people.
Roosevelt won a landslide election to become the 32nd president. FDR, the two-term governor of New York, brought a feeling of energy and optimism to the Oval Office.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
FDR's campaign song, "Happy Days Are Here Again," was symbolic of his positive, take-charge approach as president. And with a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress, he was able to make swift reforms that became known as the New Deal. In just his first 100 days in office, FDR proposed and Congress approved more than 15 new pieces of legislation aimed at providing relief for the needy, recovery for the faltering economy, and reform of the American financial system. Just one day after becoming president, FDR declared a bank holiday, closing all banks and preventing any further withdrawals of money by depositors who had lost faith in the banking system. Then, he persuaded Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act, authorizing the U.S. Treasury Department to inspect the country's banks and allow only those that were financially solvent to reopen. The act offered loans to those banks which needed assistance, and with the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which provided federal insurance for bank depositors, Americans began to cautiously trust the banks once more. The Federal Securities Act helped to restore public confidence in the stock market, as did the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which prevented the manipulation of stock prices. Perhaps the most confidence-inspiring action by the new president occurred only 8 days after his inauguration. Roosevelt took to the airwaves as millions gathered around their radios for his first fireside chat. He explained in simple terms the steps he had taken to reform the American economy. Roosevelt's direct, personal approach to the American people was reassuring and helped him garner the support of Americans to enact several more policies in his push toward recovery. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was formed to put young men to work. The CCC planted 200 million trees in the Great Plains to prevent future soil erosion and built roads, parks, and flood control systems. The pay was only $30 a month, but almost 3 million men got much-needed employment. Meanwhile, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided $500 million in direct aid to the homeless, unemployed, and ill. The New Deal also created the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which provided funds to the states so that they could build schools, libraries, and other community buildings and create jobs for their citizens. When the PWA failed to diminish unemployment quickly enough, Roosevelt launched the CWA, the Civil Works Administration. The CWA created more than 4 million jobs, and workers built 40,000 schools and 500,000 miles of roads. In June of 1933, FDR's administration was able to pass the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA. It established a code of fair practices for various industries and set prices to ensure fair competition. The act also recommended minimum wages and maximum hours for workers. Meanwhile, the Tennessee Valley Authority was organized to build dams that provided electricity, flood control, and of course many jobs for poor farmers in several southern states. That same year, Roosevelt also submitted the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which limited crop production in order to increase crop prices and help reduce surplus. Despite launching all these wide-sweeping new pieces of legislation, some critics felt the administration still hadn't gone far enough in helping the poor and reforming the economy. Some feared the New Deal was mostly benefiting already wealthy business owners and that it gave too much power to the government. Even ex-President Herbert Hoover was a vocal critic of FDR's New Deal policies.
We have seen the creation of a most gigantic spending bureaucracy. That is not only a reduction of your standard of living, but of your freedom and your hopes.
By 1935, the Supreme Court decided that the NIRA was unconstitutional, saying that its enforcement of federal employment codes went beyond the government's powers. The following year, it held that the Agricultural Adjustment Act was unconstitutional as well, because agricultural controls and regulations should be decided by individual states. Dismayed and fearing conservatives and the Supreme Court might unravel the New Deal, FDR proposed an intriguing bill to Congress. Roosevelt's so-called court reform bill would have added 6 more justices to the Supreme Court. Justices he, as president, would nominate. It was obvious that FDR would choose those sympathetic to his New Deal policies. The proposal was promptly nicknamed the Court Packing Bill. The bill failed and tarnished Roosevelt's image. Regardless, because of court resignations, the president was able to appoint 7 new justices in the next 4 years who did support his policies. But FDR hadn't seen the last of his critics. Roman Catholic priest and radio broadcaster Father Charles Coughlin reached over 40 million listeners each week as he challenged the New Deal. Coughlin wanted a guaranteed annual income for Americans and a nationalization of banks. In time, however, his anti-Semitic comments cost him most of his supporters. Dr. Francis Townsend, another outspoken opponent to FDR's policies, claimed Roosevelt wasn't doing enough to help the elderly. Townsend won widespread support with his demand for a national pension plan.
This money to be collected by the government and returned directly to the people from whom it was collected in the form of pensions every 30 days.
Most vocal was Louisiana Governor and then Senator Huey Long. Although a supporter of Roosevelt at first, later Long had nothing but criticism for him. The Kingfish, as Long was often called, intended to run for the presidency and championed a nationwide social program called Share Our Wealth.
We've had the promises from the president many, many times. And now we're wanting a fulfillment. No empty words, no empty messages mean anything to us. And no kind of law except one that gives employment and homes and comfort and education to our people will satisfy us in the least.
A great many Americans agreed with the Kingfish, and more than 27,000 Share the Wealth clubs sprang up across the country. In 1935, at the height of his popularity, Long was assassinated.
So now to your question, where's this money coming from? If you remember us discussing the First World War and the American Civil War and essentially any war we've been involved in, we didn't have enough money to pull it off. We had to spend more than what we made. In fact, for the First World War, we had enough to pay for about a third of our cost. We borrowed the rest. We would not have been able to fight the Revolutionary War without loans from France and Spain. And generally, wars have contributed to the national debt more so than any other aspect of public policy. Well, we spent as much on the New Deal as we did on the First World War. We spent roughly $33 billion on the New Deal and about the same on the First World War. And like with the war, we didn't have the money to pay for it. So that means we're going to have to borrow. And when a government is spending more money than what they make in tax revenue, that's called deficit spending. And as you just heard in the clip, there were a number of conservatives who felt strongly opposed to this policy. In fact, there were groups called the Liberty groups. I'll come back to them in just a moment. But number one, conservatives were claiming that this was a step towards socialism, that the government was taking too active a role in the economy. And then, as you saw in the clip, there were liberal critics as well that were saying we need to go a step further and guarantee a base income for all Americans. Well, the Supreme Court got involved. The National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, that the government did not have the right to interfere in business in those ways. So Roosevelt responded by introducing the court packing bill, where he was going to add more Supreme Court justices who were loyal to his perspective, and that would overturn these cases. Now, by 1937, Roosevelt had been in power since 1932. One of the privileges of the president is picking new justices. And so by 1937, 7 justices had retired, and FDR was able to appoint new ones. And this is what gave him the influence to push through what he called the Second New Deal, which we'll look at more tomorrow. But the critics, conservative opponents, formed the American League. They believed that these measures to combat income inequality and create jobs were depriving Americans of their personal property and rights. So the classic conservative critique of liberal economic theory is they call it socialism, and that socialism represents a threat to American freedom. Now, FDR, when you think about it, was a democratic socialist. He was elected democratically, and he was instituting and creating socialist programs. Social Security is a socialist program. These jobs programs were socialist programs. The military, the police, government, education, public education is a social program for the benefit of all that requires taxpayer money. And so really what conservative critics were saying is by taxes going up, that's less money that I'm making with my paycheck. And so their criticism was that's a violation of personal property rights. But again, there were critics on the left. And what we have to understand is there were communist and socialist movements going on all around the world in response to the economic crisis. And there were a number of Americans that wanted us to go fully to the left, to guarantee employment for all. And that is full socialism. Or to guarantee a base income for every American regardless of employment status. Again, so there were some that wanted us to go all the way. Father Charles Coughlin that you heard about wanted the government to take over the banking system entirely. And Roosevelt wasn't prepared to go that far. The Senator Huey Long was one of the more famous critics that hoped to implement full socialism in the United States.